Have you ever wondered what happens when a massive empire just collapses? It creates this huge power vacuum. And what we're going to talk about today is how that vacuum didn't just lead to one nation's fight for its own freedom, but how it became a brutal battleground for the world's biggest superpowers. This is a story about opportunity, about betrayal, and a fight that would absolutely change the course of history. And that really brings us to the core question here. When an empire falls, who, or what, rushes in to fill that empty space? For French Indochina, this wasn't some philosophical debate. The answer was going to be written in blood, and it set the stage for a conflict that would echo for the rest of the 20th century. Okay, so let's set the scene. The year is 1940. The world is on fire with World War II, and France, a huge colonial power, has just been defeated by Nazi Germany. And that one event, happening thousands of miles away, sends these massive shockwaves all the way to Southeast Asia, creating a huge crack in the foundation of its colonial empire. Just look at how fast things changed. For almost 100 years, France was the undisputed ruler. Then, bam, 1940, their homeland is occupied. And just a year after that, Japan, Germany's ally, basically just walks in and takes over Indochina. Now, if you're the Vietnamese people, you're watching all this chaos unfold, and you're not just seeing disaster, you're seeing an opportunity. For the first time in generations, your colonizer is weak, and that dream of independence, it suddenly feels real. You know, a power vacuum never stays empty for long, and in Vietnam, a new force was rising up to fill it, a group born out of this burning desire for independence. They were called the Viet Minh, and their leader was the now famous revolutionary Ho Chi Minh. So who exactly were the Viet Minh? Well, they formed in 1941, and their goal was crystal clear: get all foreign powers out of their country. That meant the Japanese first, and then the French. And here's a wild twist of irony for you. Because they were fighting Japan, they actually became temporary allies with the United States. Yep, America was arming and supplying its future enemy. All right, fast forward a bit. World War II is over, Japan has surrendered, and for one brief, shining moment, Vietnam is free. But that independence, that taste of freedom, was about to be snatched away, not by a defeated enemy, but by the very countries that had just won the war. Think about this timing. Literally, the same day the Japanese officially pulled out, Ho Chi Minh stood in front of a massive crowd and declared the independent Democratic Republic of Vietnam. After nearly a century of being ruled by someone else, it really felt like the dream had finally come true. But this moment of hope was cast against a really dark backdrop. Decades of French colonial policies were all about taking resources out of Vietnam, not helping the people who lived there. That, plus the chaos of the war, led to an absolutely horrific famine. As many as 1 million Vietnamese people starved to death. So for them, independence wasn't just some political idea, it was a matter of life and death. And here is where the international politics gets really, really messy. The Allies agreed they needed to disarm the Japanese troops left in Vietnam, but to do it, they split the country in half. Now look at this chart. In the north, China was in charge, and they actually recognized Ho Chi Minh's new government. But in the south, Great Britain took over. And, this is the crucial part, they refused to acknowledge Vietnam's independence. And that one decision was going to be fatal. Britain's refusal to recognize the new republic was the opening France had been desperately waiting for. With their own country now, free from the Nazis, the French were dead set on getting their old colonies back, on reclaiming their glory. And just like that, the stage was set for a whole new, even more brutal war. And right here, this is one of the most fateful turning points in the entire story. The American president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was firmly against colonialism. He did not want France coming back. But Roosevelt died, and the new president, Harry Truman, saw the world in a totally different way. He saw it through the lens of the Cold War. For Truman, a communist Vietnam was a much bigger threat than a French colony. America's ideals of self-determination were suddenly pushed aside. So what happens when a superpower changes its mind? This happens. Just a few weeks after Vietnam declared its independence, with Britain's approval and America turning a blind eye, French warships pulled up to the port city of Haiphong and just opened fire. An estimated 6,000 civilians were killed. That was it. That was the spark that lit the fuse of the First Indochina War. So, what do? You've been abandoned by the West. Your dream of freedom is being crushed. You're left with a pretty stark choice. And this quote just says it all. Facing the return of their old masters, the Vietnamese people decided they would fight. They knew they couldn't win a straight-up fight against the French army, so they turned to the one thing they had left: guerrilla warfare. For 4 long, grinding years, the Viet Minh fought a war of attrition. It was brutal. And then, in 1949, 2 huge global events happened thousands of miles away that would completely change the game. They transformed this colonial war into a frontline battle of the Cold War. Just look at this. First, in August, the Soviet Union gets the A-bomb. Boom! The U.S. nuclear monopoly is over. Then, just over a month later, Mao's communists win the Civil War and take over all of China. In the span of a few weeks, the entire global chessboard was redrawn. All of a sudden, the Viet Minh weren't fighting alone anymore. They now had a powerful communist neighbor on their border and a nuclear-armed superpower backing them. And the effect on the ground was immediate. It was dramatic. Before 1949, you have the Viet Minh fighting this scrappy guerrilla war, with leftover WW2 weapons. After 1949, they are transformed. A steady stream of modern weapons, advisors, and supplies starts flowing in from China and the Soviet Union, turning them from a small resistance group into a real, modern army that could go toe-to-toe with the French. So by 1953, the tide has completely turned. France is losing. The war is costing them a fortune in money and lives, and the French public is sick of it. They're getting desperate. And desperate people make big, risky bets. They came up with one final, high-stakes gamble to try and win the whole thing in one decisive blow. France was on the ropes, no doubt about it. They needed a game changer, a knockout punch. So they bring in a new commander, General Henri Navarre, and they give him one single mission: come up with a plan to crush the Viet Minh once and for all. And the plan he came up with, the Navarre plan, well, on paper, it looked pretty brilliant. Step 1, build a massive, untouchable fortress deep in enemy territory at a place called Dien Bien Phu. Step 2, use that fortress as bait to draw the main Viet Minh army into one big, conventional battle. Step 3, annihilate them with France's superior planes and cannons. The final step, drag a broken enemy to the negotiating table and get the terms you want. So you might be asking, why this one spot in the middle of nowhere? Well, to the French, it looked perfect. It was in a big valley, which meant they could build an airstrip and supply the whole base by air. And, crucially, it was surrounded by these steep, jungle-covered hills that they believed were completely impassable for heavy artillery. They thought their base would be invincible. They were convinced they had set the perfect trap, and it was all built on one single, fatal assumption. And that brings us right to the edge of the cliff. The French were supremely confident. They bet everything on the idea that an enemy could never drag heavy cannons through a dense jungle. But here's the thing. They had made that exact same mistake once before, back in 1940, with a place called the Ardennes Forest, right before the German army poured through it and conquered France. The question is, will history repeat itself?